Hey everybody, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. We are back for another exciting video today. It is a balmy 5 degrees here in the Twin Cities here in January, so I decided to wear my sailboat my sailboat polo here today, and I got Bigfoot Bob behind me, and we are all ready to go. We are ready to rock and roll, as it were. So I'm excited to be back. Last week I did take a little break, a little bit of needed rest and vacation, and I did get away for a while, but now I am back and I am ready to film and really get back into the swing of things. And I'm really looking forward to getting back into the grind of Reformed Truth or Ministry, along with all the other things that make up the day to day of my life. So that's what we're going to be going at today. And the topic that we're going to be covering today is a serious topic. It's an important topic. It's a topic that I've made mention of before on this channel when talking about other things, but I've never dedicated an entire video to it. And this is the missing 411 phenomenon. So, for those who may not know, the missing 411 phenomenon is, as the name suggests, it is these strange appearances that happen in the national parks of the United States, and these cases also take place in places in Canada, but in the woods, in the forests, in the wilderness areas, in primarily in the national parks, but also some cases in state parks. And we need to understand that these cases are range in the thousands of different cases, different people who have gone missing. And as we're going to be talking about, these are unsolved cases of people who have mysteriously, under very strange circumstances, gone missing in the woods. And this is a phenomenon that really doesn't, there's a lot of theories, and there's even, as we're going to talk about today, there's some theories that are even pretty credible, but there's not a lot of full on answers. There's still a lot of mysteries surrounding this topic. And this is a really practical topic because if you have not researched this and if you do not have any awareness of it at all, especially if you're someone who, as I do, enjoys the outdoors, likes to, if you've ever gone camping, this is something that's practical because this happens to not just inexperienced woodsmen or campers or hunters, but this has happened even to very, very experienced wilderness people. So people who have been out in the woods their whole lives, people who have either camped or hiked or hunted for sometimes decades of their life. Some people who are very comfortable and they will mysteriously disappear. They'll go missing without a trace. And the cases vary. There's a lot of things that are very strange about it. In some of these cases, you get very young children who have gone missing, 2 to 3 years old, and you would say, well, okay, maybe they get separated from their parents. That's even though that's a tragedy, that's not necessarily strange because they wouldn't be experienced in the woods. But then in some of these said cases where there were young children, they will be found again 9, 12 miles away. And you go, well, how on earth did a 2 or 3 year old isn't going to be hiking miles and miles and miles at a good pace. And then in a relatively short amount of time, sometimes the bodies have been found way down the way in a different area of the woods or the wilderness. So the cases like that can be very, very bizarre. In some of these cases, like I said, that you have people who have been in the woods, hunters for 30 years, and people who have hunted, who have defended themselves, who have known their bushcraft, as it were, people who have learned how to camp, how to make fires, how to gather necessary materials, know how to work their way through all of the various aspects of being in the woods. And what happens is sometimes they will disappear without a trace. You never see their body or any of their belongings again. They are just completely gone. Sometimes they will disappear, but they will find just a backpack. Sometimes a body will be found. Sometimes they have found everything is missing except just their clothes are folded neatly on a log or next to a tree, as if they were taken off, folded, and placed there, which is very, very bizarre. That's something that has come up in a lot of missing 411 cases, is the fact that there have been folded clothes placed. And as we're going to go through breaking through down some of these theories today, we're going to see that this is going to go into some of these more paranormal avenues. We're going to talk about how this isn't all necessarily to people getting lost or people would say maybe it's an attack from wild animals. We're going to really go and see that there's more going on here, that some of these experienced people just are not disappearing without a trace, without good reason. That has to be, we have to go to other theories, as it were, and that's really what we're going to see today. So really where I want to start with breaking this down is I want to start with even the title of the phenomenon, missing 411. And in the smartphone era, the area, the service code 411 might not make a lot of sense. We know what 911 is. That's emergency services. So if you got to call the police or another emergency service, perhaps the fire department, you would call 911. But 411 is directory assistance. So, back in the day before the age where you could Google anything you want, you need to look up a business or a person, perhaps you need to get a phone number, you would use directory assistance. You would dial 411. Now, so you can see where this name, because these people are going missing 411. Directory assistance. Where are they? You got to find someone. You dial 411. So you see in the name where that name is coming from, and I just wanted to point that detail out because I think it helps just paint a clear picture of what's going on with this phenomenon. And the next detail I really want to share is that the main researcher who's going to come up, and I've watched some of his documentaries. This gentleman has a lot of best-selling books, and there's a lot more research I need to do going deeper into this phenomenon, which is something that I do want to do. Is the main researcher who's very, very well known is David Paulides. And we've talked about David Paulides on this channel because when we interviewed Travis Carpenter about his dad, Scott Carpenter's Sasquatch research, we ended up talking about how Scott Carpenter, that was Travis Carpenter's father, we interviewed the son of this famous Sasquatch researcher. He talked about how his dad, Scott Carpenter's Sasquatch research, that doing work on Sasquatch DNA, he collaborated with David Paulides, which was really, really interesting. And then in that interview, I'd really encourage people to go back and watch it. At one point, we were talking about portals, which is a very mysterious phenomenon. I'm going to mention these again near the end of this video. And Travis Carpenter told us how his dad had seen what we would call an interdimensional portal or a portal to the spiritual realm, which is something that is a very important topic, but something that a lot of people would say is crazy. A lot of people are probably not prepared to have that conversation, unfortunately, but these things exist. I dedicated a whole chapter to portals in my book, Apparently the Monsters Are Real, a crash course in cryptids, monsters, and other wacky stuff. And it's an important topic. And the reason why I bring up the subject of portals is because when Travis Carpenter was telling us about how his dad saw portals, that footage, Scott Carpenter either sold, I think he sold it to David Paulides. So this is a gentleman, David Paulides. He's done a lot. He's a really credible private investigator. He's done research into these missing 411 cases. His cases have gotten into stuff such as UFOs. We're going to talk about UFOs today. Things like portals, cryptids. It gets into some of this more paranormal stuff. But you got to understand is that he always goes through a very good process of going through the more traditional explanations. And then as he works his way through things, he's willing to be open to some of these more traditional avenues, but he doesn't immediately go to those crazy places until all of the other doors have been closed. As that saying goes, when all other explanations do not work anymore, whatever is left before you, no matter how insane it may be, is what the truth is going to be. If you read people who read detective novels, they're going to know what I'm talking about. That is where you have to go. You eliminate, okay, could it be this? No. Okay, what about that? No. And as you work your way through it, and this is what comes up with these missing 411 cases, okay, could they have gotten lost? Okay, that doesn't make sense. This person's been in the woods 30 years. could they have been attacked by a bear or a mountain lion or a cougar or a wolf, a timber wolf, whatever it is, depending on where you are in the country? Well, these people, there would be remains of that, right? If they were in this area, we knew what area they were in, they went missing, and they got attacked by a bear, then why are there no remains? So those type of things get eliminated very quickly, and then you got to go, okay, well, did somebody take them? There were nobody in the area. You work your way through, and that is the type of meticulous research that David Paulides has done over 1,500 of these cases. He's done just countless research into these cases, and he's noticed that a lot of these same themes come up where you have to go to some of these more obscure routes to start to explain the missing 411 phenomenon. So that's really what we're going to talk about today. David Paulides, like I said, he's written a series of best-selling books. You can look those up online. But he has 3 documentaries, and I did watch some of these documentaries because I wanted to, in preparation for this. And these are all available for free. You can watch them for free on YouTube they're free with ads, so they're not pirated or anything. This is YouTube has them up. You can go watch them. I think the third one in particular, the one on the UFO connection, I'm going to put in the show note because it's going to help give a lot of explanation to what is going on. I'll talk more about the UFO stuff here in a little bit. But his 3 documentaries, Missing 411, so that's his first one. And then he talks about Missing 411, The Hunted. And that one he talks about how, as I've already mentioned, even experienced hunters are going missing in the woods, which should be a real eyebrow raiser. So it's not just drunken, stupid teenagers in the woods getting lost. It's not like the scene. You remember the scene in Jaws where the teenagers, they get drunk and they go swimming, and what happened? They get eaten by the shark. That's not the type of situation that we're talking about here. It's sometimes these are people who have been in the woods really their whole lives and know what they're doing. And I know I've emphasized this a lot, but it really does need to be emphasized that these are the type of people who are often going missing. We've had those other cases where you get the young children, but there's a lot of range and spectrum, but it includes very experienced woodsmen. So Missing 411, like I already said, Missing 411, The Hunted, and then his third documentary, Missing 411, The UFO Connection. And that's where he starts to really make a case that there is a connection between the Missing 411 phenomenon and the UFO phenomenon. So that's something that is really important. I'm going to talk about that more in a little bit. So that really gives a good foundation for understanding what is going on. And one of the things that really struck me about this is that this has been going on really for decades. One of the cases that is mentioned in the first Missing 411 documentary is this person who went missing named Bobby Bizup at Camp St. Malo. And this case was as far back as 1958. So that gives a little bit of context of how long this is something that's been going on for a long time. And it's something that is been going on for decades. So this isn't necessary. I think this phenomenon has intensified, but I don't think that it's something new. So I think that's something that we really do need to keep in mind. And the other thing that we need to talk about, I've already mentioned how this is going on primarily in our national parks. And what we're going to really see here is that the national park services, the park rangers, there is a real complicity to this that I think they have known that this is going on for a long time, especially because with the internet age, this phenomenon has exploded. And that these park services really don't acknowledge this the way they should. I think there is some real complicity here. And you start to think through the implications of this. When a family goes camping, you're going on vacation, and maybe instead of the beach vacation, we're going to go camping. We're going to go, these park services are supposed to be there so families can enjoy amongst other reasons. And you're not thinking that you're driving into danger. And to think that we think of the friendly park ranger wearing the wide brim hat with the Smokey the Bear look, and they're supposed to be friendly. And I believe many of them are friendly. Many of them are well intentioned. I'm not trying to villainize all park rangers. You may go and get your camp license at the service center before you go to your campsite. this is kind of what we think of. And we're not thinking that, oh, these people may have knowledge that we could go missing in the middle of the woods. But as these cases have come one after the other, we have realized that the National Park Services, they do have more knowledge, and the government in general has more knowledge than they're letting on about this phenomenon. And I think that this was, even to a certain extent, I'm going to make mention to some more popular culture, to the X Files. In season one of the X Files, and you got to understand that the X Files, the big reason why that show was as popular as it was, that it took a lot of real well-researched paranormal phenomenon. They did a lot of research into UFOs and other paranormal stuff, and they put it in a fictional format, and they had good actors who made it believable. And that's why that show really took off. And I put this season down, season 1, episode 20, Darkness Falls. They actually talk about how some people are going missing in the national parks. They don't use the actual word national parks, perhaps to avoid controversy. But that episode was back in season 1. That's 1994. They were talking about this, and that's exactly what they're portraying: people going missing in the woods, and government authorities from on high covering up. That's really the whole theme of the X Files, especially with the UFO episodes. That there's elements within the government even putting pressure down on the FBI in the show to cover up the UFO phenomenon, and that's what it's been called. Same thing with the movie Men in Black. And there are real men in black. I've even considered at some point doing a video on that, where people will have experiences with UFOs. And what happens is that they have, a lot of times you have people who have not been tinfoil hat people who have not been looking for trouble, as it were, and sometimes they have this stuff. They have sightings right in front of them. Their life has changed, and then if they start talking about it, or maybe even if they're not talking about it, maybe just in fact that the word gets out that they had a sighting, and these mysterious three-letter agency people show up at their door, and they find themselves having to deal with pressure from on high, or maybe even worse. Sometimes these people can go missing themselves, and it can be a very scary thing to really have the darker elements of the world kind of crash onto their front door. So that type of stuff really does happen as well. So I wanted to emphasize that this stuff is going on in our national parks, that this stuff has been going on for decades. I think there is a knowledge of this amongst our federal government that includes the National Park Services, that this stuff has not been more or less acknowledged. They're not really trying to deal with the problem. It's kind of an open secret, as it were. And when you go into David Paulides' own work, he really goes into a lot more detail, kind of laying out all of that entails. But I'm obviously just giving a general summary of it. So that kind of gives a good overview of what we're talking about. So I think what I want to cover next is, I've talked about how there is a potential paranormal or supernatural component to a lot of these cases. We've talked about how this is going on primarily in our national parks. So what I want to do now is I just want to start breaking this down. And I've already started to do this, but what you got to do, and I'm summarizing a lot of cases here, is you got to start, if you're a good investigator, you're going to observe the details of what's going on. You're going to say, okay, is there where were they last sighted? And then you're going to go, okay, is there any remains of them? And depending on the case, sometimes a body will be found. Sometimes bodies have been found miles away, like I've already said. You're going to be looking into details. Were they old? Were they young? What was their mobility? Yeah, what did we find? Did we find folded clothes, like I said, neatly on the log? Are you going to say, did we find nothing at all? Who did they last talk to? These are all details you're going to go through systematically. And that's the type of stuff that does go on. And here I just wrote down some of the things that could potentially happen. And I'm going to start with the more traditional, easier to explain type explanations, and I'm going to work my way down to the more what we would call controversial, conspiratorial, insane, paranormal type reasons. So, for example, one thing you could say, okay, well, did somebody just go missing? Did they just get lost? That's possible. Or, did they get drunk the night before, fall in a river, fall in a hole, that type of stuff. Did they just not handle themselves well? Did they just make an honest mistake? Did the Mother Nature just win, as it were? Those are the first type of things that come up, and maybe in some cases that could legitimately be an explanation. But like I've said, thousands of these cases exist. Sometimes these people are very experienced, so you obviously can't explain everything away with those type of things. And then I've already made mention of, what about, could it be an animal attack? Bears or wolves or other animals. These are, more predatorial, mountain lions, cougars, those type of things. And, and what would happen is, if they were going to get attacked, if somebody was going to get attacked, there would often be times of a struggle. If these hunters are going missing, because we talked about sometimes these are experienced hunters that are going missing, they would probably, if they have a chance, they would fire their rifles, they would fire their weapons, so there would be gunshots perhaps heard. And a lot of times these people are just going missing completely altogether. They're gone. For all intents and purposes, they're just gone. So many of these cases cannot be explained away by animal attacks. And so those are the type of things that would go on. But then the next question would be, have they been abducted by other human beings? And and that is actually, we're going to talk about here. In a sense, that is a potential explanation that is true. But before I go into what we're going to talk about, what are called the military abductions, let me start with saying, well, a credible researcher, you're not going to start by going down what I call conspiracy theory lane and say, well, was it the military? Was it the government? You're going to be asking, well, hey, maybe somebody came and attacked them from their own lives. You would say somebody had a grudge against them, somebody hated them, somebody they upset, work life, family life. You're going to go through those type of explanations before you would go off once again into the more obscure potential explanations. But once again, I mean, not that that could not happen. Obviously, we have murder cases in this country for a reason. We have kidnappings in the crime world. Obviously, these things do happen. We live in a world where the depravity of man really does know no bounds. Where the sinful man, their hearts are on evil perpetually. So obviously, things like murders or kidnappings, those things do happen. Certainly not explaining that. But in many of these cases, once again, these cases will be investigated. There's no type of sign of that looking back at their previous lives. These are often just normal, everyday people. So it isn't people who really would be arising, the type of the 9 to 5 people, the people going to work, the people living relatively normal lives, having family lives. Every case is different. I'm generalizing this whole phenomenon as a whole, but it just doesn't make sense that we would be having these type of issues. But really, what we're going to realize here is this brings me up to what are called the military abductions, and I do believe that this is going on. This is something I really haven't talked about a lot on this channel. Actually, my friend Christopher Preston, when we did our video called the UFO phenomenon, he did make mention of military abductions, and these are called MyLabs. You can look up that acronym, but these are military abductions. And I think this is potentially a partial explanation of what's going on for this phenomenon. And one of the things you look up that is both interesting but also kind of disturbing is in that the deep underground military bases, I've talked about these as well on my channel. They're called the DUMBs, deep underground military bases. These are military bases, as the name suggests, that are built under the ground, deep, 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 miles under the ground. Oftentimes, this is where elements of our government, our military, are doing things behind the scenes that they don't want the public to know about, including very nefarious and evil things, the type of things they don't want to be seen by the common public. And these are the type of things that they have decided it would be best, the deep state, the secret elements of our government have decided it would be best that the public doesn't see it all. So it's more convenient to move these things underground altogether. And Timothy Alberino, he's coined the term called the dumb state, the deep underground military base state, because he's talked about how really these secret, unaccountable elements of our government with the Dumbs, that they have really moved into what he has called potentially the breakaway civilization. So they're elements of our government and our military. These are the elements of our government that would in our military that would know about UFOs, that would know about some of these secret things. They really have moved to a place where they are really beyond the accountability and control of congressional oversight. And that's a secret evil world that's really hard to unravel for the average, no pun intended, for the average Joe. But they have really moved as much as they can into these deep underground military bases because they want to avoid the scrutiny of the public eye. And as I've said, they are avoiding those elements of congressional oversight that they want to do. And contact with UFOs. That some of these bases there have been credible whistleblowers who have talked about UFOs being seen, being worked on in these deep underground military bases. That these quote gray aliens. And I don't believe they're aliens. I believe there's a demonic component to the Greys. I have a whole chapter on the Greys in my book. For example, when I went to New Mexico to research, I actually drove up to Dulce because I wanted to see if I could. I didn't make as much progress as I would have liked, but went looking for that deep underground military base, or at least just wanted to film the area where it was and say, this is the area, guys, or this famous deep underground military base with connections to the Greys is. So you can go back and watch that video, Hunting After the Greys in New Mexico. I made that video as well. But really, what I'm getting at here, guys, is the reason I'm bringing up the deep underground military bases is because of the fact that um, the entrances to many of these deep underground military bases is located. The entrances to them are found in many of our national parks. And that makes sense for a couple of reasons. The first reason why that makes sense is because the national parks are all they're public land, but really what they are is they're federal land. So this goes back to Teddy Roosevelt, the creating of the parks, and he said he wanted to create the national park system for the preservation of this wilderness. And I think there is some good that came from that. The libertarians, it's when you read some of the historic libertarian literature, they really don't like that the government did this because they seized so much land. But obviously, it did lead to the wilderness being preserved, and we can enjoy it. And it's not that wasn't necessarily the worst thing ever, depending on your views on it. But you need to understand it when we talk about the public land of our national parks, it's federal land. The government owns the land. That's practically what it is. So that's one reason why it would make sense that these secret bases, that the entrances would be in the parks. And the other reason why it makes sense that the entrances to these deep underground military bases would be located in these parks because they're in the middle of nowhere. It's wilderness. I mean, obviously there's national parks and there's tourists there that go and camp and hike and enjoy them, but they're not metropolitan urban centers. So that's another reason why, if they wanted to keep these bases secret, that these national parks are often very large, miles and miles of wilderness, that they could stick an entrance in a part of that area of that federal land, and it would be very, very easy to keep it secret. But when researchers have done that work, they've really plotted out that, hey, these bases that we are aware of, even though they try to keep them very secret, and they say, hey, the entrances are located to these national parks, which would make it very easy that if the military and the government wants to abduct people, and this does happen, look up once again, MyLabs, these military abductions, that's what the acronym, MyLabs, that is something that goes on and can even be more scary than the alien abductions. And Christopher Preston was talking about how he believes, when we did our interview, the UFO phenomenon, he was telling me how he believes that in some cases, not necessarily all, but in some of these cases, he thinks that some of these things that are getting explained as alien abductions may actually be due to military abductions, to the MyLabs. So that is a train of evidence that really does need to be understood in light of the missing 411 phenomenon. The next thing that we'll talk about is it could be cryptid attacks, things that cryptids could be taking people. And when we've talked about Sasquatch, when we did our interview with Michelle, where she interviewed us, I did talk about in that interview how Sasquatch, when you read the old Native American legends, that the old Native American legend, that Sasquatch were known to take. The Native Americans would tell these kind of campfire stories to their children about how um, they would talk about how these children, if you're being bad, the Sasquatch will take you, or that there's in the legends and in the ancient history, it'll talk about how women would be taken by these Sasquatch. And researchers like L.A. Marzulli have talked about how there seems to be a more relatively passive or peaceable strain of Sasquatch, and then there seems to be a more aggressive DNA strand, which I think is pretty credible. I think there's still some level of conjecture to that, but we could talk about that. That because we know that cryptids exist and they exist in the remote parts of the world. That is a potential explanation for what's going on in some of these cases. And then I actually think some of these other cryptids, like the Dogman or the Wendigo, are even more dangerous than Sasquatch. I mean, Sasquatch is an 8 to 9 foot tall cryptid. It can be very dangerous. I wouldn't want to play with it. It's something you don't want to mess with without having some level of spiritual and also physical preparation. But the problem is that even some of these other ones are even more dangerous. I mean, the Dogman that's a like a werewolf like creature. Some researchers think werewolves and dogmen are more or less the same thing. Others make distinctions between them. That's a conversation that can be had, but they're very dangerous. The dogman, and it is cryptids have become somewhat more popular amongst fringe circles, people who talk about the paranormal, who talk about cryptids. Sasquatch has always been the most well known, the most well researched, the most popular, but the Dogman has gotten far more traction than it used to. So that's something that we could talk about as well. And then obviously, in some areas of North America, there's reference to this cryptid called the Wendigo, which is, I think, a type of cryptid where if you encounter it, unfortunately, you're probably, apart from the grace of God protecting you, you're not going to survive. So that's something that could be mentioned. But the problem is, in some of these cases, once again, these would be a creature that, just like a bear or an animal attack, they're going to attack you. Would there be signs of a struggle? Now, I think a Sasquatch could grab you and grab all your stuff. And in some of these specific cases with missing 411 where there's nothing missing, um, that would potentially make sense. But this is where we come to the UFO explanation, which I think is a very credible explanation. Now, my opinion is that with the missing 411, I need to do more research. This is conjecture on my part, so take this for what it is. But I think the combination of the military abductions and the UFO connections, and also the portals, which I'll talk about in a minute, I think the phenomenon could be explained by a combination of all these things together. Now, what is the most prominent causes? I don't know. But I think all of these things that I'm talking about, human abductions, or the military abductions, cryptids, the UFOs, and the portals, those four things. There we go. There's four. I can't count apparently. 1, 2, 3, 4. I was sick. I was sick today. They taught that in school. But I digress. But anyways, I think all four of those explanations provide a very credible explanation for what's going on with the greater phenomena. I'm actually pretty open that it may not just be specifically just this one thing or that one thing, but depending on which specific case you are talking about, it could really be something that could be a combination of these different factors. But with the UFOs, really what we're talking about here is that I think because the alien abductions, even though I think some of them could be explained away from the military abduction, the UFO is a real phenomenon. And there is deception to it because I do not believe it is extraterrestrials in outer space. Please go and watch the videos that I've done on my channel on biblical cosmology. Space is a lie. Space is fake. I know I'm going to lose a lot of people by saying this, but the truth is the truth. NASA's faking the pictures, all the rest of that. So when I talk about the reality of the UFO phenomenon, I do believe the crafts are real. And I think that I really lean more toward an interdimensional hypothesis more than an extraterrestrial. But the crafts are real. And the beings that are piloting the crafts are real. And our government is in connection or has been in contact with these entities, which I think at their root are demonic. I really like the explanation that L.A. Marzulli gives about how these grays. He actually thinks this is going to sound crazy, but I think that he talks about how the bodies may be kind of like a shell or a meat suit for these spirits, which at their core may be demonic. Or it could simply be an interdimensional being that is in itself demonic, but it's just preternatural. It's just physical. It has a body, but it's spiritual at its core. Because Christian prayer, despite some people trying to deny this, does in most of these cases, it will drive away these aliens, these quote unquote aliens. So there is a deception around the UFO phenomenon, but there is a very real phenomenon. The crafts are real, and the beings are real, and the abductions are real. Those three things need to be acknowledged. And in some of these missing 411 cases, David Paulides talks about this in his documentary called The UFO Connection, and he talks about how that these many of these people who are going missing, it does seem to be that these crafts are coming above some of these people and are taking them. So just as they may be taking people from their homes, and that's what we think of with the traditional alien abduction experience. Somebody's sleeping in their bed 2 or 3 in the morning, the craft may come over the house. Maybe this house is like a farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere. Nobody even knows that it's going on, and that they're able to levitate someone out of their bed through the window and up into the craft. That can be what is going on. And that is something that is what is the traditional alien abduction experience. But in some of these missing 411 cases, we're saying the same type of thing would be happening, and it often happens when these experienced hunters are out hiking by themselves. And what happens is that these people will be hiking, then they're gone. And then perhaps only a backpack is seen, like I've said, or perhaps the folded clothes. And then, but they're gone. And the idea would be that they have been taken up into the UFO, which may sound crazy, but David Paulides, he really goes through some of this in in his documentary. I got a couple examples here from. You can go back. I'm going to include the documentary in the show notes. You can watch that. But he had one individual from Vancouver, British Columbia, and it was Ray Salmon. And this was somebody who, as I've been suggesting when I've been generalizing these cases, this was someone who had been hiking and hunting in this area. He had a camper in this area. He had been in this area, knew the area, had explored this area for years and years and years. This was an experienced individual. And he went missing under very mysterious circumstances. And when they ended up doing the search, um, it really became evident that the Canadian Royal Mounted Police, that they really got involved in the search in ways that obviously they should get involved in the search, but some of the details were very strange. And that it's talked about how they brought a full emergency response team, essentially an armed SWAT team with automatic weapons, which is very strange for a missing persons case in the woods. As Paulides talks about in the documentary, it became evident that this man, Ray Salmon's wife, that the police were not very forthcoming with giving information to the wife, and even lying about some of the details to the wife. That there was clearly things about this case that were strange. And as they explain this case in the documentary, what really came out was that there was this woman who had worked for the Canadian Royal Mounted Police for many years, because they were talking about the connection to this, to the UFO phenomenon. And this woman, Gail Starr, who had herself been a Mountie, a Canadian Royal Mounted Police, she talked about how if the case, as this case was indicated, had connection to UFOs, she said in the documentary, this is credible testimony for someone who was a Canadian police officer, that they have a policy in Canada, and I think it'd be similar here in the US, that when a case goes in a direction where there's connections to UFOs, that they give that information up to higher government authorities. And she even herself, not because she was trying to hide it, but she was saying she doesn't even herself know who the higher ups, who that necessarily is, or what that entailed. She just says that yep, that information goes up the food chain, as it were. It's documented by some secret government agency, and that's what happens. And that a lot of these details are covered up. So those are the type of issues we're dealing with, guys. We're in a lot of these UFO related cases where people may be going missing. the government would have, because of this connection to UFOs, very good reason to want to not disclose this information to the public, not disclose it to families, because it's part of an agenda that they want to keep hidden from the greater masses. Even though with this quote disclosure movement that's going, more and more details about UFOs are starting to come out. And I think it's coming out in a way that's controlled. They're letting out certain amounts of truth mixed in with the deception, and that's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down. But going back to this specific case where the authorities, this information is secreted up to the higher levels of secret government, and then there's good reasons not to let the wife of this individual know what's really going on. So that's a really good example of the connections to UFOs that we have been talking about. And then the other case I want to make mention of really quick is there were these two hunters, hiker hunters in Idaho called Chris Bales and Bob Sinker. And these two individuals were hiking in the area, the wilderness of Idaho, the state of Idaho, and they are out there moving. And they tell this story about how they're out by their camper and they had their supper and they go back out and they're out there moving through the woods. And one of the individuals, he actually turns around 180 degrees and faces his buddy who was about to be taken by this large triangular UFO. And the implication of the story, you can, in the documentary, and I'll share the link to this, you can listen to them explain it in their own words in a little bit more detail. But they talk about the implication is that, hey, if I hadn't turned around, that this thing would have probably taken my buddy and he would have been gone almost before my eyes. Not literally before my eyes, but I would have turned around. One moment he's there, one moment he's gone. That's what I'm trying to say. And I think the implication is a lot of these cases, and David Paulides has talked about this, where in a lot of these cases, it's, even though these are very experienced guys, it will be single individuals out by themselves who go missing. And so the implication, what they're really trying to say in that story, is that because it's a pair, maybe because these UFOs are trying to keep this program secret, maybe because they don't want certain details to come out about what they are doing, that they may, even though they still could take that person, they want to pass that person by because it's not part of their plan. And when we get into the UFO program, it's obviously very controversial because it gets into what is called the quote alien breeding program. And as I've said, I don't think these are extraterrestrials because I think we've been lied to about the entire phenomenon of outer space. And I don't have time to cover that all right now. You can watch the videos I've done on biblical cosmology. But the UFO phenomenon is still real and that people are being taken. These quote alien abductions are real. I think at its core, there's a demonic core to these entities. And that's a lot to cover there. But these things are going on. And this really harkens back to Genesis 6, to the days of Noah. That is what's going on. And they are taking from the men sperm, they're taking from the women eggs that women have talked about being impregnated on these abduction on these crafts, whatever. And that is something that is going on, and that these people have claimed they'll be operated on these medical operating tables on these crafts. And that really brings back to the folded clothes. And this is something that is perhaps one of the strangest details of this entire phenomenon. It's something that I should make mention of and talk of. David Paulides, he put forward this theory, and it's just a theory, it's just conjecture, but it kind of does make sense that if these crafts are taking these individuals and they're operating on them in a nefarious medical type context, and it's supposed to be these ships kind of a sterile medical type environment, perhaps because these crafts do have a type of levitating technology, are they leaving those clothes there because they're working on these individuals in a medical way? That may make sense, it may not, but that's a theory that David Paulides has put forth. He talked about that when he was interviewed on Blurry Creatures, which I thought was very interesting in my opinion. And so that's something that could be talked about. And because the same thing, we go back to the military abductions or human abductions. And as I said before, I think that is a credible line of thinking. But then why the folded clothes? Why are they left behind? Wouldn't it be better in that scenario just to have everything be gone, which does happen in some cases, And then other people have said, well, could they be leaving the clothes there intentionally to throw people off the scent? That's a theory too. So there's a lot of conjecture. There's a lot of mystery around this whole phenomenon. But all of this to say though that there is a very real potential connection to the greater UFO phenomenon. And as I always say, even though these are not extraterrestrials, I lean more toward an interdimensional hypothesis, more of a spiritual explanation for this. And it does harken back to the Genesis 6 days of Noah stuff, the things we've talked about with the Nephilim. This UFO phenomenon really harkens back to what was going on then. It's slightly different context, but the same type of things. It harkens back to the spiritual warfare that is going on in our day and age between Jesus Christ and the devil. That is really what this stuff is really pointing to. So we really do need to understand, guys, it's something I've emphasized on this channel that yes, the phenomenon is real. And even though the aspects, they're pushing it as this extraterrestrial thing, that's the deception side of it. But the phenomenon itself is if you can define your terms and clarify things and make distinctions, it is a very real phenomenon that is going on. So we need to understand both sides of that. And I know that gets complicated and that challenges people because they want it forces them to challenge multiple of their quote boxes where they might have a grid where, well, one, this phenomenon is not real at all, and you may be comfortable there, or if you go two, and then on the other hand, you're saying, but there's a deception around space, and this is actually there's a demonic component to this. Like you're trying to piece all these things together, even though when you break it all down, which I've done over many videos, those explanations do make sense. But that challenges a lot of people. They struggle with that. They have a hard time with that. I know that when I say that, I might lose people, but that's just the truth is the truth, and you got to get it out. So that's really the UFO side of it. I think I've covered that. And then the last thing I want to make mention of is the portals. I've talked about the portals before. They're very, very important. And people could be going missing in these portals. So that's hence why the portals is one of the lines of thinking on this whole missing 411 phenomenon. So that being said, we need to understand that there are portals that exist in parts of this country, in remote places, and across the world, and they're very mysterious. We don't have a ton of information about them. When I talked to Travis Carpenter in my interview, and he was talking about how his dad, Scott Carpenter, this well-known Sasquatch researcher, saw one of these portals and got it on video, and he actually sold that footage to David Paulides. So it was really great for me to be able to talk about that with his son on this channel. That was a cool moment for this channel. And I talked about portals in my own book. I got it here again to show. Apparently, the monsters are real. I did a whole chapter on that. So it was really a cool moment for me when I got to talk to someone, not firsthand, but secondhand, somebody, a credible line of inquiry. And it was cool to really have that conversation on this channel. And we need to understand that these portals are real. The Native Americans knew about them. They talked about them. They articulated them in the parlance of their times. But really, they talked about how there were certain mountains, these Native American tribes, they wouldn't go up certain of these mountains, or they wouldn't go past a certain point. And they obviously knew they were going up into kind of the spiritual realms. And it's fascinating. Cultures across the world have always made connections between mountains and the divine. Like mountains are the connection between the divine and the earthly. And we even see those themes in scripture. That's actually a scriptural type that we see when you study biblical theology. Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, all of these mountains. It's a reoccurring theme. Moses goes up the mountain. So mountains is a big theme, but it's really fascinating here in the North America that there have been mountains where these Native American tribes believed that there were doorways, portals. Science fiction has called them stargates. The movie Stargate, even though once again the space stuff is obviously wrong, but they really get into the reality of these portals in that movie Stargate. So science fiction has a way, the predictive program, they like to lay down little trails of breadcrumbs hinting at the truth, and that movie does that. It certainly does. Just how we talked about how the X-Files had a lot of little truths embedded in it, which is what made the stories gripping and interesting. Same thing with the movie Stargate. These portals are real. One of the mountains that I want to make mention of, Mount Shasta. You look up this mountain, very large peak. I believe Cascade Mountains, California. Well, anyway, Mount Shasta, is one where there have been many, many instances where it's been talked about portals existing. And then Scott Carpenter and Travis Carpenter told us about this Smoky Mountains, Tennessee. There's portals there as well. So there's multiple parts of the world where they are. And then we obviously don't know. I had a lady who's corresponded with me. We've had a great correspondence. She talked about how she believed how evil these portals are. And I think they're things that we're probably not supposed to be messing with, not supposed to be touching. I would be very, very weary if I saw one to go anywhere near it. But these portals are real, and it may be a potential avenue of explanation for at least a part of this missing 411 phenomenon. So just to sum up everything I've said, I think whether it's the military abductions, cryptid attacks, potentially the UFO phenomenon, crafts taking people up into the craft, or the portals, as crazy as that may sound to people who have not gone into this world, I think those are all very real lines of inquiry to help explain some of what's going on. So the last thing I want to say, guys, I think I've just tried to give a general summary of this. I know I could have went into a lot more detail on specific cases. I named a few, but I know I could have went into a lot more detail. I would start by watching the documentaries by David Paulides. That's a really good place to start. And if you want to go further into that, I would recommend you could go to his books, and there's research online you could do. And perhaps I'll go into more detail in the future covering some of this, but this at least lays some good groundwork for what we've talked about. And the last thing I just want to say practically is that this is kind of a warning that if you are, I'm not saying never go into the woods. I go into the woods. I'm not trying to be hypocritical about this, but you need to be aware of the dangers. You need to be praying about this, and you need to be thinking through what is best for you and perhaps also your family. So that is really where the rubber meets the road. Because if thousands of people are going missing in our national parks, that's something that as humans, if we have compassion, we should care about that. Even if this issue did not have connection to some of these other paranormal things that I talk about on this channel, this would still be something that should be very relevant. We should care that these people are going missing. So that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where this video gets practical. That's why this video is important. It's very easy to see the practical application of why we should be talking about this topic. There's a lot of other things going on, other things that people may say are just as important or more important, but I think that this is a topic that was definitely worth me contributing at least one video to, and perhaps it's something I will return to in the future as well. So that's what I have to get, guys. This was just a summary and an introduction to the missing 411 phenomenon. All that being said, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. God bless everybody. If you have been blessed by the ministry of RTM, then please consider supporting our ministry through Buy Me a Coffee and check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.